Does the animosity between the American and Iranian governments have to extend to the American and Iranian people? Not necessarily. We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. What to do about Iran? America's relations with Iran's clerics went sour in the 1970s, highlighted by the Iran hostage crisis. Today, U.S.-Iran relations remain bad, and Tehran's controversial nuclear program doesn't help. Is Iran after nuclear weapons? Do its prominent military exercises hint of war? So far, at least, the world's response has been economic sanctions, political pressure, and some military posturing, such as American ships in nearby waters. Recently, an added complication. Major earthquakes have hit Iran, leading to pleas for humanitarian relief. For some ideas on what to do about Iran, we turn to today's guest, Ambassador Ulric Haynes. He spent decades working in and on Iran. Most notably, Haynes was U.S. Ambassador to Algeria during the 1970s Iran hostage crisis and was instrumental in the negotiations that led to the American hostages' release. Welcome to the show, Ambassador Haynes.
Thank you for having me again.
You have spent decades crisscrossing the world and, not unlike journalists and soldiers, heading in the direction of crises rather than the other way. Most notably, the situation in Iran. What is it that has compelled you to move in the direction of crises rather than to avoid them?
Well, in the case of Iran, there was no compulsion other than the fact that at the time that I first went to live in Iran and had close contact with Iran in the early 1970s, I was the vice president for the Mideast and Africa of the Cummins Engine Company, the diesel engine manufacturer. So my first contact with Iran and in that part of the Middle East was not as a diplomat. It was as a businessman and as a resident of Tehran. Later on, events took over, and I found myself ambassador in Algeria at a time that the United States government was looking for someone to act as an intermediary in the Iran hostage crisis. And why did we need an intermediary? Because we had used the old-fashioned and time-honored technique of showing our disapproval by breaking diplomatic relations with Iran over the hostage crisis, and that meant we had nobody to talk to. So we needed to have somebody to act as our spokesperson, and I was able to convince my government that because of Algeria's impeccable credentials as a Muslim nation and as a friend of Iran and of the United States, that they might be the ideal interlocutors.
Tell us a little bit about the situation that led to the hostage crisis, including the period of the Shah before the clerics took over.
Well, the conditions that led to the crisis predated the crisis itself by decades. The United States had played a role in supporting the Shah of Iran at a time when his popularity with his own people was at an all-time low. For example, the people had elected to serve in the government, and who a very distinguished member of an old Iranian family, Mossadegh, Prime Minister Mossadegh. He was extremely popular with the Iranian people because he was an eloquent spokesman for their independence and for their freedom from direction by any external power, including the United States. At the time, that did not sit well with the American government, and with the aid of the CIA in Iran at the time, headed up by, oddly enough, the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt, we engineered the overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh. That did not set well with the Iranian people. Interesting that the animosity of the people was against the American government, not against individual Americans or against the American people, whom they liked very much, up until the overthrow of the Shah. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Iranian students came to study in the United States.
What was it that the Shah did that was perceived to be so bad?
Well, he had an extremely oppressive regime, a regime that was so oppressive and so popular that the Shah himself would never drive in a motorcade in his own city. If he was going from one place to another in Tehran at the time that I was there, he would go in helicopter. And there would always be 3 helicopters at the helipad and the royal compound. And he would, at the last minute, decide which of the 3 he would take to avoid being shot down, assassinated. I'll give you a personal example. My family and I, when we were living in Iran, lived in a community called Gamart, which was very near the largest prison in Tehran, where the Shah was routinely imprisoning opponents or imagined opponents of his regime. And I'll never forget one morning driving my daughter to nursery school. We passed the prison, and outside of the prison were many, I would say easily 100 or more Iranian women dressed in black chadors, waiting to get some word of their relatives and friends inside the prison. That brought my attention to the fact the more people that an oppressive regime imprisons, the more enemies it gets. And in a country where families and clans are very extensive, you put one person in prison and you've got 300 people opposed to you. Put 1,000 people in prison and figure you got close to a couple of million who don't like you. And it was so bad that in Iran at the time, even we as expatriate residents would not discuss Iranian politics in front of the servants in our house because we didn't know whether they were working for the secret police, the Savak, and would report us and result in our being either imprisoned or expelled. So the climate that existed under the Shah was not one that in any way assured his continuing in power.
Mm-hmm. So the Shah is deposed in the revolution of 78 to 79, and the clerics take over and the Iran hostage crisis occurs. So then your involvement, tell us how that progressed.
My involvement in the hostage crisis?
In terms of the hostage crisis.
Yes. Well, years later, several years later, with the American embassy having become the focus of a lot of protests by particularly young Iranian students. The students took it upon themselves to invade the American embassy, occupy the embassy, and take American diplomats prisoners. They immediately released all black embassy employees, saying that black people in America had suffered enough and they didn't want to cause future suffering. And they also did the same with most of the American women, all except 2 from USIA. My own opinion is that this was a student-initiated, university student-initiated action. The Iranian revolutionary government, not wanting to appear as if it were not in control of events in its own country, then co-opted that particular action and adopted it as its own. And that's where the problems began.
Fast forward then to the point where you've been successful in contributing to the release of the hostages. What was that day like for you?
The day was incredible. Since the administration of President Carter was coming to an end, in a matter of days, around the middle of December, I urged the State Department to move its negotiating team from Washington to Algiers, my embassy in Algiers, because that would save us time. And they agreed, and Warren Christopher, who was Deputy Secretary of State at the time, came over and lived in my embassy residence in our guest room for, I believe, 14 days. We immediately got the accurate impression that the Iranians were as anxious to get this monkey off their back as we were to get our hostages back. And I had, because of my experience in Iran and the Middle East, had convinced my colleagues that the Middle East and Iran was culturally an area where exaggeration was a cultural fact of life, just as I think it is today with Iran threatening to use atomic weapons. I don't think they have them, but they talk big. And the reason for talking big in the Middle East is to impress those that you're talking to. I can't tell you how many times I had people in Algeria, for example, when I would mention the president, say, "Oh, he's my uncle." He wasn't their uncle at all. It was a way of making me, of engendering my respect for them. And the Iranians were doing the same thing with us. They asked us, I believe initially, for $35 million to get our hostages out. And I urged our team, ignore them. They don't expect $35 million. They want these people out of their country as badly as we want them back. Think about it. They're at war with Iraq. This is just an additional monkey on their back. And fortunately, my assessment was correct. And we didn't pay anything for them to release our hostages. They just kept acquiescing and acquiescing. It took time and patience. And we got them out. At the airport, I'll never forget, my wife accompanied me to the airport. The Algerians had sent 2 planes to pick up the hostages, 2 Algerian airline planes. They never told anybody which planes carried the hostages. One plane landed and another plane landed, and they both pulled up to the tarmac. And then one of them opened the doors, and we knew this must be the one with the hostages. And there was an agonizing moment. What was going on inside, I didn't know, was that they were debating in what order should they get out. And they decided that Bruce Langen, who was the chargé d'affaires in Tehran, and the two women, the two USIA detainees, hostages, would come off first, and then the others trailing afterwards. And that's how they came off. And there was, you know, we Americans are not physically demonstrative people, but when they came down those stairs, there was a lot of hugging and kissing, and it came from the heart.
So that fortunately had a happy ending. But today Iran finds itself again in the midst of an international crisis, and you touched on some of this when you said that there was a lot of exaggeration in the behavior because it wants to impress those listening. But you know, we're watching the developments in the nuclear research, we're watching military exercises, ground, air, and sea exercises that seem to be full of all kinds of capabilities. And is that part of the same context, do you think?
I think it's part of the same context of exaggeration. There are enough experts who have expressed doubts in the Iranian ability to develop nuclear weapons for me to question the judgment, particularly of the Israelis and some of the hawks in our government. As I said before, this is a part of the world culturally that exists on exaggeration. If you want to respect me, I have to impress you. And if I have to impress you by saying that I have nuclear weapons, I will do it. Now, in the context of our culture, that's lying.
On the other hand, Iran has been, on a regular basis for decades, stirring up trouble in its neighbors, especially among minority groups, religious and otherwise. And even now, Iran is involved, and many charges have been made against it in terms of its activity in Syria. Any thoughts on that subject?
Yes. What we have to understand is that it costs Iran, in terms of money, almost nothing to upset the United States. All they have to do is open their mouths and threaten. And what do? We mobilize. And it costs us millions, if not billions of dollars. They have learned that the cost for them to keep the pot boiling is negligible when compared to the costs to the United States. There are a couple of things that have happened in the United States since I was a university student that have led to a very, very profound weakness in our foreign policy. One is the almost total disappearance in the study of foreign languages. The easiest way to learn about another person's culture is to study the language, how they put words together, how they put ideas together. It tells you a lot about how they think. And the other is the disappearance of the study of anthropology. Everybody who lives in this now global world of international politics should appreciate the cultural differences that are at the basis of the tactics used by those we want to engage or those we consider our enemies. It's a paradox to me that the Iranian people understand and know the American people so much better than we know them. They watch our television, our movies, they wear our blue jeans. They know us, and we just don't know them at all.
Well, what would you do if you were called on to provide some advice on this crisis as we move forward? What would be some immediate, simple steps you'd recommend?
Well, first I would come down heavy on the Israelis to stop threatening, because they are only fanning the flames. They're not contributing to intimidating the Iranians. One of the things you have to understand also culturally, particularly among those of the Islamic faith. To die for a worthy cause is to guarantee your entrance to heaven. So threatening Iranians doesn't do any good. What we're doing is promising them fulfillment. So Israel, cool it. Secondly, we've got to consciously improve the quality of our intelligence in that part of the world. We have tens of thousands of Iranian immigrants living in this country. A horde of them in Los Angeles. People who know their country. Use them to gather intelligence through their relatives who are still in the country. Many of them go back and forth between Iran and the United States. But our intelligence seems to be so poor, second-hand at best, for a nation with as sophisticated an intelligence capacity as the CIA. We are woefully ignorant. For God's sake, don't go it alone. Let's talk to our European allies, to our allies in the Middle East. Let's make sure that they are with us and that this is, whatever our response is, it is not viewed as an American response.
What's the single best recollection you have of the release of the hostages? And are you going to write the definitive book about this experience at some point?
So many definitive books have been written. The one piece that bothers me the most is the piece that I have seen no one deal with, and that is what might we have done that triggered the seizure of the hostages. And I tend to feel that happened in Algiers, and it was the fault, and I call it the fault, of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who came to Algiers for the funeral of Houari Boumediene, the president who had died, and who insisted on meeting with the Iranian delegation to the funeral without the approval of the President of the United States or the White House or the State Department. When I questioned Dr. Brzezinski about this, he brushed me off and said he didn't need approval. And I said, well, would you like me to go along to take notes afterwards? And he said, no, he did not want me to go along. So he met with Prime Minister Bazargan alone. I don't know what went on, but shortly after Bazargan's return, he was removed from office, imprisoned for a while. He didn't have any authority to meet with the Americans. And I believe that, if not caused, contributed, that meeting contributed to the Iranians asserting themselves in a way to show that they were not under the thumb of the United States of America as the Shah had been.
Great. Well, thank you for your insights today, Ambassador Haynes.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.